New York never slept, but on that night, it held its breath, waiting for a man who would change the rules of the underworld forever. It was the kind of night when the streets glistened like polished steel, washed in rain that refused to fall heavy but clung to the air in a mist. The Lower East Side pulsed with its usual rhythm, trolley bells, footsteps, drunken laughter spilling from tenement doorways, but something deeper hummed beneath it all. A silence not of sound, but of fear. New York was wide awake, yet holding its breath, as if it knew that tonight a new order was being written. And the man walking those wet cobblestones, hat pulled low, cigarette burning steady, was me, Charlie Lucky Luciano. I didn't ask for the silence. It followed me like a shadow, like the city itself understood what was coming. I wasn't the loudest man in the room, never needed to be. Noise is cheap. Silence. Silence is power. When people lower their eyes as you pass, when whispers trail you like perfume, that's when you know you've arrived. That night, the whispers carried my name, and every man on those streets knew it meant change. Understand something, I wasn't born with this weight on my shoulders. I wasn't handed crowns or thrones. What I had was a crooked grin, a gambler's luck, and a mind sharper than the knives men carried under their coats. They called me lucky, sure, but I knew better. Luck don't build empires. It just keeps you alive long enough to build one yourself. The Lower East Side was my school. Tenement walls so thin you could hear a neighbor's prayers, kids fighting for scraps, mothers breaking their backs in sweatshops. We were all immigrants, all hungry, all desperate. That hunger, it never leaves you. It shapes you, drives you, whispers in your ear when you lie awake at night. By the time I was grown, that whisper had become a roar: take more, climb higher, never look back. And in the 1930s, there was plenty to take. Prohibition had turned liquor into liquid gold. The old mafia bosses, clinging to their Sicilian traditions, fought over scraps like it was still the old country. But America was bigger, faster, sharper. The streets didn't care what village your grandfather came from. They cared about muscle, brains, and who could deliver. I knew the old guard was blind to that truth. I knew their time was ending. As I walked through the night, I could feel eyes on me. A Cadillac eased down the block, its headlights cutting across the wet pavement. I recognized it, one of Joe Masuria's boys behind the wheel. Joe the boss, he thought he had New York locked in his fist, thought young men like me were just playing at power. What he didn't know was that the board had already shifted, and the king he thought he was? He was already a pawn. I ducked into a small cafe, nothing glamorous. Just a joint where the espresso was bitter, the bread was stale, and the backroom stayed darker than midnight. Waiting for me were Meyer Lansky and Benny Siegel, my closest allies, my chosen brothers. Meyer leaned forward, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "Charlie," he said quietly, "the old man thinks he's untouchable. But one move, one smart strike, and the whole game tips over." I smiled that half-smile people said made me look like I was always in on a joke no one else knew. Truth was, I usually was. "Meyer," I said, "it's not about striking hard. It's about striking smart. Masuria's fighting with yesterday's rules. We're writing tomorrow's." Benny laughed, restless, impatient as always. "Then let's write it now. I say we flip the table and watch the old guard scatter." That was Benny, fire in his veins, too quick to pull the trigger. Me? I was ice. I knew timing was everything. You rush, you bleed. You wait, you win. And that night, with the city's silence pressing in around us, I knew the time was close. The cafe door creaked open. A man stepped inside, dripping rain, his eyes scanning the room. For a heartbeat, they locked with mine. He froze, then turned to the counter, pretending he wanted coffee. I didn't move. Didn't need to. That's the thing about reputation: when it walks into a room ahead of you, the work's already done. I finished my cigarette, ground it out slow, and stood. Adjusted my coat, my hat, spoke calm and steady. "Gentlemen," I said, "we've got work to do. We stepped back into the night. The Cadillac was gone, but the silence was heavier than before, like the city was holding its breath even tighter. Neon lights flickered across puddles. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot cracked, but here, in this stretch of Manhattan, no one moved. They were waiting. Watching. The streets themselves knew a storm was coming. But here's the secret: storms don't just destroy. They clear the air. And the empire I was about to build? It wouldn't roar with thunder. It would whisper, silent, but unshakable. That night, walking through the damp glow of the city, I wasn't just another gangster. I was the architect of something larger, something colder, something built to last. My name would not only echo in alleyways and speakeasies but across time itself. And though New York didn't know it yet, history was already tilting. The silence wasn't fear anymore. It was possibility, the kind of possibility only a man like me could see. The night belonged to lucky Luciano. And soon, so would the city. Before he was the king of Manhattan, he was just Salvatore from Sicily, a boy learning that survival meant more than innocence. They say you can't understand a man until you know where he came from. And me? I came from dirt. From stone walls and narrow alleys in Naples, Italy, though my bloodline stretched back to the island of Sicily, where honor and vendetta were as common as bread and wine. I was born Salvatore Lucania, not Lucky Luciano. That name, that legend, it came later. First, I was just another immigrant boy chasing scraps, dodging beatings, and watching men gamble away the little they had. Naples was no paradise. It was a place where children grew up fast because childhood didn't last long. My father was a sulfur miner before he crossed the ocean, a man with rough hands and a tired back. He wanted something better for his family, but in Italy, better didn't exist for people like us. So he took a chance, packed us into the belly of a ship, and set our eyes on America. The voyage was long, filthy, and cruel. Imagine hundreds of families crammed into steerage, no windows, barely any air, the stink of sickness everywhere. Babies cried themselves hoarse. Old men coughed until their chests rattled. Mothers clutched children close, praying the ocean wouldn't swallow us whole. I was just a boy, but I understood something: survival meant more than comfort. You didn't cry, you didn't complain, you endured. When we reached Ellis Island, it was like stepping into a storm. Thousands of faces, strange languages, officials barking questions we barely understood. They changed names, shortened them, twisted them into something American. Salvatore Lucania became Charles Luciano. Just like that, I was reborn not by choice, but by necessity. We settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Tenements stacked 10 stories high, windows broken, hallways crawling with rats. One apartment, 5 people, and a stove that barely worked. My father tried to keep us straight: work hard, pay bills, pray on Sundays. But in America, a hard day's work barely bought bread. And when you stepped outside, the streets taught you lessons no church ever would. The neighborhood was a battlefield of cultures: Italians, Jews, Irish, Germans, each block its own kingdom. Fists and knives decided territory. I learned fast that being small didn't mean being weak. It meant being smart, finding angles, knowing when to fight and when to talk your way out. And believe me, I fought plenty. That's how I met Meyer Lansky. We were kids, different blood, same hunger. Meyer wasn't big, but he was sharp. He had eyes that saw through you and a brain that worked like a machine. The other kids picked on him for being Jewish, for being small. One day they cornered him, and I stepped in. Didn't do it for charity, I did it because I saw something in him. The same thing I saw in myself, a refusal to bend. From that day, we were bound. Then there was Benny Siegel. He was fire where Meyer was ice. Quick fists, quicker temper, always ready to prove himself. Some said Benny was reckless. Me? I saw loyalty, courage, and a kind of madness that was useful in the right hands. Together, we weren't just kids. We were building something: friendship, trust, the beginnings of an empire. School? That was a joke. I sat in classrooms, sure, but the lessons that mattered were learned on the streets. Protection rackets, dice games, small hustles, anything to put money in our pockets. I charged kids a nickel a week to walk home safe. They called it extortion. I called it insurance. By 12 years old, I was already learning what men twice my age hadn't figured out: fear and respect are two sides of the same coin. But don't think it was all games. There were nights my stomach ached from hunger, mornings I woke to my mother crying over bills. Poverty has a way of carving you hollow, leaving room only for ambition. I told myself, never again. Never again would I watch my family suffer while I stood powerless. If the system was rigged, then I'd beat the system my way. The 1910s in New York were chaos. Immigrants flooding in, gangs forming on every corner, politicians dipping their hands in every pocket. The cops? Bought and paid for. Justice wasn't blind, it was for sale. And if you had brains, if you had guts, you could buy yourself a slice of the city. I learned English on those streets, picked it up fast, twisted it into something sharp. The Irish gangs respected fists, the Italians respected bloodlines, but the Americans respected money. So that's what I chased: not pennies, not scraps, but real money. Enough to make a name, enough to buy respect. Every empire has roots, and mine started here, in the dirt and blood of Manhattan's immigrant blocks. I was still Salvatore to my family, still Charlie to the neighborhood, but inside, I was becoming something else. Something colder. Sharper. They called me lucky later, after I survived beatings, stabbings, arrests that should have buried me. But the truth? It wasn't luck. It was vision. I saw beyond the brawls and the corners. I saw a city that could be controlled, not by brute force alone, but by structure, by organization. While the old men fought about Sicilian honor, I was thinking about business. About America. From Naples to New York, my journey wasn't about distance, it was about transformation. I wasn't just escaping poverty. I was escaping smallness. I was chasing something bigger than survival, power. And as the years passed, the boy who stepped off that ship at Ellis Island faded. In his place stood the man who would one day sit at the head of a table, commanding bosses like generals, reshaping the very idea of organized crime. But in those early days, I didn't know how far it would go. All I knew was that the streets were mine to learn from, and I was a fast learner. The night New York fell silent belonged to lucky Luciano. But the boy who first walked off that ship? He was still in there, buried deep, whispering, "Never forget where you came from, but never let it hold you back." Some men earn respect. Others take it. Luciano? He was learning to do both. Names carry weight in New York. They get whispered in alleys, scribbled in police files, carved into headlines. And in those early years, my name was still just Charlie. But the streets had a way of testing a man, pushing him, reshaping him until he wasn't who he used to be. That's how Salvatore became Charlie, and how Charlie became Lucky. It didn't happen overnight. It happened one cut, one hustle, one brush with death at a time. The Lower East Side didn't hand out respect, you had to bleed for it, sometimes literally. And believe me, I bled plenty. I was barely a teenager when I started running with the 5 Points gang. Paul Kelly was the boss, a sharp-dressed Italian who spoke English better than most politicians. He wasn't some mustached whirling thug, he was a strategist, a businessman. And under him, I learned my first real lesson: crime wasn't just about muscle, it was about money. Money opened doors that fists never could. But muscle still mattered. Fights broke out daily, over dice games, over girls, over nothing at all. You had to be ready to swing, to take hits, to stand tall when the dust settled. That's where I earned my scars. One night, a group of rival punks jumped me in an alley. Knives flashed, fists flew. By the time it was over, my body was carved up, my throat nearly slit. The papers later called it a miracle I survived. The neighborhood called it luck. From then on, the name stuck, Lucky Luciano. But luck wasn't what saved me. What saved me was grit. I crawled out of that alley, bleeding, half dead, but I didn't fold. I came back stronger, harder, colder. The scars across my chin and neck became my calling card, proof that I could walk through hell and keep going. Men respected that. They feared it too. As I grew older, my game got bigger. Petty rackets turned into real money. I ran gambling dens, extorted businesses, dipped my fingers into bootlegging. And with prohibition roaring, the profits were endless. America was thirsty, and I was ready to quench it for a price. But I wasn't reckless. No, I studied people. That was my real talent. I could read a man in seconds, know if he was bluffing, lying, scared, or loyal. In poker games, in backroom deals, in alleyway negotiations, I always had the edge. I treated it like chess, every move calculated, every risk measured. And I never showed all my cards. That's what separated me from the hotheads. Guys like Benny Siegel, God bless him, he loved the rush. He'd pull a trigger just to feel alive. But me? I thought about tomorrow. About the bigger picture. That's why Lansky respected me. That's why even older bosses started to keep an eye on me. I wasn't just another punk with a knife, I was thinking like a boss before I ever wore the crown. Still, respect didn't come easy. Older Sicilian bosses saw me as too American, too ambitious, too willing to break traditions. They wanted loyalty to the old ways, the mustache Pete code. I wanted loyalty to results. If you made money, if you kept the peace, you had my respect. Bloodline didn't matter. Nationality didn't matter. Only business mattered. This philosophy put me at odds with men like Joe Masuria, the so-called king of the Italian mob. He wanted control through fear, through brute force. But fear without brains? It crumbles. I knew his time was limited even before the Castellammarese War broke out. But I'll get to that later. For now, know this, every step I took, every hustle I ran, every scar I carried, it all built the reputation that became Lucky Luciano. The name wasn't just about survival. It was about inevitability. People started believing I couldn't be killed, couldn't be beaten. That myth, that aura, it worked better than 100 guns. Men thought twice before crossing me because they believed fate itself was on my side. But fate is only half the story. The other half is betrayal. And betrayal was a lesson I learned early. There were friends who sold me out to cops, rivals who swore loyalty and then turned coat. Every time it happened, I got colder. Trust became a rare coin, spent only on men who proved themselves over and over. That's why Meyer and Benny mattered so much. In a world of liars and traitors, they stood solid. I knew I could count on them, and they knew they could count on me. By the late 1920s, I wasn't just another gangster. I was a name on every cop's desk, a target in every rival's mind. I wore fine suits, smoked the best cigars, drove cars most men only dreamed of. But none of it softened me. If anything, it made me sharper. Because the higher you climb, the more hands reach to pull you down. I started to see the future, not just my future, but the future of organized crime. The old ways were dying. The world was changing, fast cars, phones, movies, money moving across oceans. Crime had to change with it. No more petty street wars. No more blood feuds over pride. The real power lay in organization, in structure, in building something bigger than one man. And that vision, that's what truly made me Lucky Luciano. By the time the 1930s arrived, I had carved out my place. I wasn't yet the boss of bosses, but I was close. The old guard whispered my name with fear. The young bloods whispered it with respect. And the city itself seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. But every rise has its tests. Every empire has its wars. Mine was coming fast, and it would be bloodier than anything the city had ever seen. Still, I wasn't worried. I had survived knives, bullets, betrayals. I had built alliances, sharpened my vision, and earned the name Lucky. And as I looked across Manhattan, with its neon glow and restless energy, I knew one thing for certain: this city was mine for the taking. Some partnerships are built on contracts. Ours? They were written in blood, in whispers, and in the smoke-filled backrooms of New York. They say a man is only as strong as the company he keeps. In my world, that wasn't just a saying, it was survival. You needed men you could trust with your life, your money, and your secrets. And in the crooked streets of New York, trust was rarer than gold. But I found it, or maybe it found me, in two men who became more than just allies, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. To most of the city, we were just street kids with too much ambition. To each other, we were brothers in crime. Meyer was the brains, calm, sharp, always 2 steps ahead. He wasn't flashy, didn't care about making headlines. He cared about numbers, about structure, about turning crime into a business. He could look at a balance sheet and see the future. Where other guys saw quick cash, Meyer saw empires. Then there was Benny Bugsy. My God, Benny was fire. Handsome, reckless, quick with his fists and quicker with his gun. He had a temper that could light up a room or burn it down. But behind the wildness, there was loyalty. If Benny was with you, he was with you all the way, even if it meant a bullet. Together, the three of us were unstoppable. The Italians respected me, the Jews respected Meyer, and everyone feared Benny. We were building something new, an alliance that cut across old world lines. And in a city where Italians stuck with Italians, Jews with Jews, Irish with Irish, that was revolutionary. It all started small dice games, card rooms, backroom bootlegging operations. Meyer kept the books clean, Benny kept the muscle hot, and I kept the deals moving. The profits stacked up faster than we could spend them. But more than the money, it was the loyalty that mattered. In a world of betrayal, we created a pact. We looked out for each other. We covered each other's backs when the bullets flew. When the cops came sniffing around, we kept our mouths shut. That bond, it was thicker than blood. I remember one night a rival crew tried to muscle in on one of our gambling dens. They thought they could scare us off. Benny didn't hesitate, he stormed in with that wild grin of his and sent a message the whole city heard. The rival crew never came back, and word spread fast: you don't cross Lucky, Meyer, and Benny. But it wasn't just muscle. Meyer had visions no one else could see. While others were content running rackets on the Lower East Side, Meyer was already mapping out national networks. He talked about connections in Chicago, in Miami, even out west. He said crime could be franchised, organized, run like a corporation. He saw casinos, unions, real estate, things that felt like fantasy back then. And I listened. Because I knew he was right. Together, we laid the foundation for what people would later call the syndicate. It wasn't just about territory, it was about cooperation. Italians, Jews, even some Irish working together, dividing profits instead of spilling blood. It was the future. And we were the ones writing it. Still, our bond wasn't without tension. Benny's temper got us in trouble more times than I could count. He'd shoot a guy for looking at him sideways, then expect us to clean up the mess. Meyer hated that. He'd lecture Benny, beg him to calm down, to think before he acted. Benny would just laugh, light another cigarette, and promise he'd behave. He never did. But for all his flaws, Benny was our fire. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone pay attention. And when he fought like a man possessed. That kind of loyalty, that kind of fury, you couldn't buy it. You had to earn it. I knew that if I was going to climb to the top, I couldn't do it alone. The old bosses tried to rule through fear, but fear fades. What lasts is loyalty. Brotherhood. And that's what we had. The streets noticed. Soon, people weren't just whispering my name, they were whispering about the three of us. We weren't just punks anymore. We were something bigger. And the old guard? They started to worry. See, the mustache Pete's didn't like change. They didn't like alliances across ethnic lines. To them, Meyer was an outsider, a Jew. Benny was too wild. And me? I was too American. But that's exactly what made us strong. We weren't bound by the old rules. We were inventing new ones. And while the old men sat around clinging to traditions, we were making money hand over fist. Prohibition gave us rivers of cash, speakeasies, bootlegging routes, protection rackets, it all flowed into our pockets. And the more money we made, the more power we had. But money brings attention. The cops started watching us closer. Rivals started plotting against us. Even the bosses we worked under began to fear we were getting too big, too fast. I remember sitting with Meyer one night, counting cash in the back of a club. He looked at me and said, "Charlie, this thing we're building, it's bigger than us. One day, it's gonna change everything." He was right. But neither of us could imagine just how much blood it would take. Because power doesn't come free. It comes with enemies. And soon, our bond, the brotherhood that kept us strong, would be tested by the kind of war that tears cities apart. For now, though, in those roaring 20s nights, it felt unbreakable. The neon lights, the jazz music drifting through smoke-filled clubs, the clink of glasses and the rustle of cash, it was our kingdom. And we ruled it together. Every time I looked at Meyer and Benny, I saw more than partners. I saw the only family I could trust. We weren't born brothers. The streets made us brothers. And in this life, that meant everything. The city was changing, the stakes were rising, and the storm was coming. But I knew, as long as Meyer was at my side at home and calculating, and Benny was watching my back wild and fearless, I could take on anyone. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were building an empire. And soon, the world would know the names Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, not as punks, not as kids from the Lower East Side, but as architects of a new underworld. The kind of underworld that didn't just survive wars, it created them. The streets of New York were about to run red, and in the center of it all, Lucky Luciano would learn that crowns are paid for in blood. Power isn't given. It's seized. And in 1930s New York, the battle for supremacy among Italian gangs wasn't polite. It was brutal, bloody, relentless. This was the beginning of what would later be known as the Castellamarese War, a war that would reshape the underworld forever. And I, Lucky Luciano, was right in the middle of it, learning how empires rise and how old traditions die under fire. The streets were divided. On one side, Joe the Boss Masuria, the old guard, ruling with fear, insisting on loyalty to Sicily, to blood over business. On the other, Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellamarese faction, equally ruthless, equally ambitious. Both sides claimed honor, both demanded obedience, and both underestimated the changing landscape of organized crime. I had learned early that fear is a tool, but it is a blunt one. Power that relies solely on terror is fragile. Masuria was the embodiment of that philosophy. He was strong, yes. Vicious, even. But he clung to outdated codes. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. He believed in old rules, old alliances, old grudges. And that gave me an advantage. The first hits came fast. Street corners soaked in rain suddenly became stained with blood. Friends vanished overnight. Rivals turned up riddled with bullets. Every alley whispered rumors of betrayal. Every speakeasy held men calculating their next move. The city had become a chessboard, and each man, every gunman, every capo was a piece. I had to know the moves before they even thought them. I aligned with men who understood business over tradition, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, of course, but also others who had the courage to break with the old ways. Together, we watched, waited, and planned. It wasn't enough to survive. Survival was for the weak. We were aiming to rule. Masuria, stubborn as ever, made the first mistake. He underestimated youth. Underestimated ambition. Underestimated me. I played both sides when necessary, pretending loyalty to him while quietly observing, quietly plotting. Every dinner, every handshake, every whispered conversation was intelligence. Every smile concealed strategy. One night, Masuria summoned me to a meeting. A quiet backroom in Little Italy, men drinking bitter espresso,
cigars smoldering like miniature bombs.
I sat across from him, outwardly calm, while inside my mind raced. Each word he spoke, each gesture, was a test.
And I passed. But passing wasn't enough. To survive, I needed allies. To grow, I needed enemies eliminated without my fingerprints showing. That was the game.
And the game was lethal.
Meyer's advice was always precise.
Charlie, he said, don't get too close to the fire.
Let it burn around you.
Use it to your advantage.
And I did.
We used the chaos, the massacres, the betrayals to build networks, to buy loyalty, to consolidate power.
While Masuria and Maranzano focused on old grudges, we focused on business.
There were nights I walked the streets, rain mixing with the faint stench of blood, and I felt the weight of it all.
Lives snuffed out. Futures erased. Families shattered. But it was a lesson.
In this world, emotion can be a weakness. I kept my heart steady, my voice calm, my decisions sharp.
You can mourn later. First you survive. Then you thrive.
The first major hit that shifted the balance was orchestrated with precision. I won't name names, but suffice to say, when the dust settled, it became clear that the old ways, Masuria's terror, Maranzano's pride, were vulnerable. And I began to rise, quietly, carefully, above both factions.
Betrayal was everywhere.
Friends switched sides, some out of fear, some out of greed. One man I trusted implicitly delivered information to Maranzano. I dealt with him swiftly. In this life, hesitation can be fatal. Every decision carried weight. Every choice had consequences measured in blood. Yet amidst the chaos, camaraderie held me together. Meyer, ever the strategist, ensured our finances were untouchable.
Benny, ever the firebrand, ensured no one dared question our authority. Together, we weren't just surviving the war, we were reshaping it. The streets whispered about me now. Not just lucky Luciano, the boy who survived the alley knives, but the man who could maneuver between worlds, the man who could kill with patience instead of impulse. My reputation grew quietly, a shadow spreading across New York's underworld. Fear and respect, perfectly balanced. And then came the turning point.
Masuria, confident and ruthless, underestimated one critical factor, the loyalty I had cultivated among his own men. The plan was subtle, calculated, no one outside our circle would see it coming. Meetings were arranged, allegiances shifted, and one night, the unthinkable happened, Masuria was dead.
Shot execution style while dining quietly in a Coney Island restaurant. The streets fell silent again. Only this time, it was different. Not fear alone, now there was the weight of inevitability.
With Masuria gone, the old guard reeled. Maranzano, triumphant but unaware of the shifting tides, tried to assert his dominance.
He declared himself boss of all bosses, drawing borders, assigning territories, demanding loyalty. He underestimated me.
I had learned the lesson of power, it isn't just about killing your enemies.
It's about controlling perception, loyalty, and the flow of money. Maranzano's arrogance was his weakness.
Betrayals continued, but they were now in my favor. Men who had feared Masuria came to me, swayed not by threats, but by the logic of survival.
Business sense outweighed blind loyalty.
The city, still drenched in neon and rain, became my proving ground.
Even as the war raged on, I reflected on the lessons. The streets don't forgive weakness. Power is earned through a mix of fear, respect, and strategy.
I had seen friends die. Seen alliances crumble.
Seen bullets and betrayal shape destinies. And through it all, I learned to remain calm, observant, patient. That is what made me lucky. Not the name. Not the luck. But the mind.
By the end of the Castellamarese War, the landscape had changed forever. Old traditions were shattered. Young blood, ambition, and strategy had triumphed. And at the center of it all stood me, not as a soldier, not as a pawn,
but as a rising architect of a new order. The streets had bled. The empire had shifted. And the crown, bloodstained, heavy, inevitable, was within reach. The old way had died, but power alone wasn't enough. To truly rule, you had to build rules, and that's exactly what Lucky Luciano did. With the dust of the Castellamarese War settling, New York's streets were still soaked with blood, but opportunity rose from the chaos. The old guard was broken, their methods outdated, their pride misplaced. I had survived the storms, eliminated threats, and navigated betrayals. But survival alone doesn't make an empire. You need structure, rules, and men who understand that loyalty is currency. That's where the idea of the commission was born. The concept wasn't mine alone, but I was the driving force. Meyer Lansky's mind, always calculating, always measuring, helped shape it. Bugsy Siegel's fire provided muscle and intimidation when diplomacy wasn't enough. Together, we envisioned a council, a governing body for organized crime across the United States. No longer would mob bosses act independently, spilling blood over trivial disputes. Instead, profits, territories, and disputes would be mediated, negotiated, and, if necessary, enforced. Business over emotion. Efficiency over tradition. The streets had already whispered about it. People noticed how my name seemed untouchable, how rivalries dissolved before they escalated, how disputes ended with profit rather than corpses. I wasn't just surviving the underworld, I was organizing it. Turning chaos into order. Violence into profit. Fear into strategy. The first challenge was convincing other bosses to play by the new rules. Not everyone liked the idea. Old-school Italians, loyal to the traditions of Sicily, balked at the thought of Jews sitting at the same table, of decisions being made based on logic rather than pride. Some laughed. Some threatened. Some tried to kill me. But I had learned the lessons of patience, observation, and timing. You don't win with threats alone, you win by creating inevitability. Meetings were held in smoky backrooms, often under the guise of casual dinners. Men with power, guns, and grudges sat around tables, their eyes measuring, their hands itching toward weapons hidden under the tablecloth. I opened each meeting calm, precise, careful. My voice even, my tone measured, but my presence undeniable. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The weight of my reputation did it for me. Gentlemen, I'd say, lighting a cigarette, we're done with wasted blood. It's time to think bigger. You want respect? Money? Power? We can have it all if we work together. Some nodded reluctantly. Others scoffed. But slowly, one by one, the pieces fell into place. Bosses realized that the streets were changing. Violence could only get you so far. Profit could get you everything. The idea of the commission, an organized council of bosses, was not just revolutionary, it was inevitable. Meyer kept meticulous notes. Territories were mapped, disputes catalogued, rules codified. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't movies or glorified tales. It was business. Numbers, risk assessments, projected profits. Every boss had a seat at the table, but the rules were clear, act outside them, and the consequences would be swift. Not personal. Not emotional. But precise. And final. Final. Bugsy's role, though less strategic, was no less crucial. His presence kept the muscle in check, enforced agreements, and reminded the old guard that while logic ruled, fire still had a place. If a boss broke the rules, if a territory was encroached upon, consequences came, and they came without question. The muscle gave credibility to the council. Without it, even the smartest plans would crumble. The creation of the commission marked the transformation of organized crime. No longer was it scattered, fragmented, tribal. Now it was networked, strategic, structured like a corporation. Decisions were no longer impulsive. Disputes were mediated. Profit sharing became standard. Loyalty became contractual but also strategic. And all of it was under my guidance. New York became the proving ground, but the influence stretched nationwide. Chicago, Detroit, Miami, even as far west as Los Angeles are model-inspired replication. Each city had its bosses, each city had its enforcement, each city recognized the authority of the commission. I wasn't just a New York boss anymore. I was a national architect of organized crime. Of course, challenges persisted. Not everyone embraced change willingly. Some saw the council as a threat, a betrayal of old-world principles. Violence erupted in pockets, ambushes, hits, sabotage, but the commission allowed us to contain it efficiently. Our influence prevented wars from spiraling out of control. Where old systems relied on rage, loyalty, and fear, our system relied on accountability, enforcement, and structure. Yet even in structure, unpredictability remained. Men are not machines. Emotions, ego, and betrayal still existed. I had to anticipate every possible outcome, calculate every risk, and ensure my allies, Meyer and Benny, most of all, were aligned. Communication became the backbone of power. Letters, meetings, signals, coded conversations, all designed to maintain control while preventing leaks. Through the commission, I wasn't just consolidating power. I was creating legacy. The old bosses had empires of fear, temporary dominions based on force. I built a system designed to endure. Territories were no longer about pride but about efficiency. Profits measured loyalty, not ancestry. Strategy replaced impulse. And rules, carefully enforced, replaced tradition. I remember sitting in my office one night, looking over maps and ledgers, the faint glow of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. Meyer and Benny sat across, discussing the next steps. Outside, the city buzzed, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place. The streets would continue to echo with whispers of our names, of our authority, but few understood the depth of the transformation. It wasn't just about power. It was about survival, efficiency, and inevitability. I had watched empires crumble over pride, over impulses, over blood feuds. I had watched friends die and enemies fall. I had learned that the man who wants to survive, to thrive, to rule, must think not as a soldier, not as a thug, but as a strategist, a planner, a visionary. And that's what the commission represented, vision made real. Order carved from chaos. Rules written in ink and enforced with precision. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic. But it worked. And it endured. Through the commission, I didn't just survive the post-war underworld, I reshaped it. I created a system where disputes could be mediated, profits could be maximized, and authority was clear. America's underworld became more predictable, more organized, and ultimately more profitable. By the time the 1930s were in full swing, the commission wasn't a concept, it was a reality. It controlled. It influenced. It commanded. And at its center, I remained steady, calm, calculated, the architect, the mediator, the man they all recognized as Lucky Luciano. The streets had changed. The rules had changed. And the crown of power was no longer simply for those who could kill or intimidate. Now it was reserved for those who could think, plan, and enforce. And that, more than anything, defined the rise of Lucky Luciano. The empire was no longer just about the city. It was about systems, rules, and endurance. It was about transforming crime into order, chaos into profit. And while the neon glow of New York continued to shine outside, inside our smoky backrooms, a new era had begun. The rise of the commission wasn't just a shift in power, it was a shift in history. And at the heart of it, I stood, calm, observing, calculating, knowing that the true strength of a man is not in his fists or his gun, but in his mind, his vision, and his ability to create order from the storm. In the shadows of power, loyalty is tested, and even the strongest alliances can crack under the weight of ambition. Power is intoxicating.
Once you've built empires, seen alliances flourish, and witnessed obedience bend to your will, it's easy to believe you're untouchable. But history, the streets, and human nature have a way of humbling even the most formidable. And for me, lucky Luciano, that lesson arrived in the form of betrayal, political pressure, and the slow tightening of law around the underworld we had meticulously built. By the mid-1930s, the Commission had transformed organized crime into a business machine. Across the country, mobsters adhered to our rules, territories were respected, and profits soared. Yet the higher you rise, the greater the envy. And in a world built on greed, no alliance lasts forever. Even men you trust implicitly can falter under pressure, or worse, be tempted by opportunity. The first cracks appeared subtly. Men who had once pledged loyalty began to whisper doubts, to negotiate behind closed doors with rivals, to test the limits of their allegiance. It was never loud, never obvious, just a subtle shift in tone, a hesitation in a handshake, a look that lingered too long. And as a man who survived knives, bullets, and betrayal, I noticed every detail. Every nuance became a data point, a potential threat, a warning sign. I remember sitting with Meyer Lansky late one night in our office, maps of territories spread across the table, cigar smoke curling like ghosts around us. "Charlie," he said, eyes narrowing, "you feel it too, don't you? The restlessness. The men who think they're untouchable." I nodded, taking a slow drag from my cigar. "I've been watching. We've built an empire, Meyer. But empires attract predators. And not all predators wear guns." The betrayal came in waves. Some were small, a man skimming profits here, leaking information there. Others were monumental, striking at the core of what we had built. One of my closest lieutenants, a man who had fought beside me since the early 5 Points days, chose ambition over loyalty. He aligned with political figures seeking immunity and influence at our expense. The sting wasn't in the loss of territory or money, it was in the reminder that no bond, no matter how forged in blood, is immune to temptation. And yet, the law became our greatest adversary. The federal government had begun to take notice of our empire, particularly the interstate nature of our operations. Prohibition had ended, but the federal machinery was now focused on tax evasion, gambling, and organized crime. Every move we made, every transaction, became a potential liability. Men who had once controlled neighborhoods now found themselves vulnerable to investigations, indictments, and prison sentences. I learned quickly that the streets weren't the only battlefield. Courts, grand juries, and prosecutors became the new enemies. My mind, always tuned to strategy, had to adapt. I shifted operations, altered alliances, and sometimes made sacrifices. Friends were exiled, businesses closed, territories reshuffled. The survival of the empire required cold, calculated decisions. Emotion was a liability. But betrayal wasn't just external, it came from within. Some of the men I had raised, mentored, and trusted believed they could outmaneuver me. They underestimated my patience, my foresight, and the network I had built over years of careful alliances. I observed, calculated, and waited for the precise moment to respond. And when I did, consequences were swift and precise, no chaos, no unnecessary spectacle. Just execution of strategy. Yet even as I navigated treachery and legal pressure, I couldn't ignore the personal toll. The weight of power is heavy, and the constant vigilance required to maintain it can erode the spirit. Nights were sleepless, punctuated by the distant sounds of sirens or gunshots. Meals were quick, often solitary, as my mind never rested. Every handshake, every conversation, was evaluated for hidden threats. Trust became a precious commodity, rationed sparingly, even among those closest to me. And then came the turning point that altered everything. In 1936, after years of consolidating power and building alliances, the law finally struck decisively. I was arrested on charges that seemed almost trivial compared to the magnitude of our operations. Running a prostitution ring, a crime that, while serious, was a fraction of the empire I controlled. But the political machinery was determined to make an example. I realized then that no matter how carefully you build, how loyal your allies, or how brilliant your strategy, external forces can dismantle empires with a single blow. The trial was tense, public, and unavoidable. Reporters crowded courtrooms, eager to capture the downfall of the man they dubbed America's most notorious mobster.
Friends turned spectators.
Rivals whispered in the wings. And the city watched as the empire I had constructed faced legal scrutiny.
The courtroom was a stage, the trial a performance, and I the reluctant actor.
Every word, every gesture, every testimony mattered. The stakes were not just freedom, but the survival of the empire itself. Betrayal and legal challenges combined, and the fall became inevitable. I was sentenced to prison, a man who had risen from the streets to command nationwide influence, now confined to a cell. Yet even behind bars, my mind never wavered. Alliances were maintained, operations continued through proxies, and strategies adapted to the new reality. The physical confinement was severe, but the mind remained free, plotting the next move, anticipating the eventual resurgence.
Reflecting on the fall, I understood its lessons.
Power, no matter how meticulously built, is fragile.
Loyalty, even among brothers in crime, is conditional.
The streets are ruthless, but the law can be even more unpredictable. Survival requires not just strength, cunning, or ambition, it requires foresight, adaptability, and the ability to remain calm when the world seems to be collapsing around you. And so, as I sat in the prison cell, observing the world from behind bars, I contemplated the nature of betrayal, power, and the impermanence of even the most formidable empires. Each decision, each alliance, each calculated risk had led me here. But it was not the end.
The fall was temporary, a pause in the ongoing game of strategy and survival. Even in defeat, the seeds of resurgence were planted.
Correspondence with trusted allies, careful orchestration of operations from within, and the strategic patience I had cultivated over decades ensured that my influence remained, albeit constrained.
The streets still whispered my name.
The empire I had built had cracks, but it endured.
Power. Betrayal.
And the fall, these are the elements that define men and empires. To rise, one must navigate treachery.
To survive, one must anticipate it.
And to thrive, one must adapt, rebuild, and strike with precision when opportunity presents itself. The lesson of Section 7 is clear: no empire is invincible, no alliance unbreakable, and no strategy immune to unforeseen forces. Yet the true measure of a man is not just in his rise, but in how he responds to the fall. I learned to endure, to observe, to adapt, and to plan for the inevitable return. And in that quiet reflection behind prison walls, the vision of a reorganized, disciplined, and enduring empire began to crystallize, a vision that would later define the modern mafia and secure my place in history. The fall was a chapter, not the conclusion. Even miles away, even behind borders, power has a way of reaching out, and lucky Luciano was about to prove just how far influence can stretch.
Prison taught lessons, but exile tested them.
By the late 1940s, after serving years of confinement, I faced a choice that would define the twilight of my influence: remain in America under constant surveillance and threat, or accept deportation to Italy, leaving behind the empire I had built from the streets of New York.
Many thought this would be the end. Many believed that distance would erase my authority. They were wrong. Exile wasn't freedom, and it wasn't a retreat.
It was a new battlefield. From Naples, I watched the empire I had created continue without me physically present, yet my influence remained omnipresent. Men I had mentored, alliances I had nurtured, and rules I had established ensured that the commission continued to function, maintain order, and generate profits.
Distance didn't dilute authority, it tested it.
And I had learned to adapt. The streets of New York had changed in subtle ways during my absence.
Young men who once feared me tested boundaries.
Old rivals schemed in whispers. Political forces attempted to exploit my physical absence.
But influence is not just about presence, it's about strategy, reputation, and the network you cultivate.
And I had networks that spanned the country, enforced by men loyal to me and to the structure I created. From Naples, I communicated meticulously. Letters, messengers, trusted envoys, every method calculated, every interaction measured.
Meyer Lansky, though physically absent, acted as my eyes and ears, ensuring that operations continued seamlessly.
Bugsy Siegel's legacy, though tragically cut short, had instilled a culture of loyalty and decisive action among our ranks.
Even in exile, I remained the strategist, the unseen hand guiding decisions from afar.
I learned that influence from afar requires patience. Decisions couldn't be rushed, they had to account for delays, miscommunications, and the unpredictability of human behavior. I relied on trust, yes, but also on redundancy, multiple eyes on key operations, cross-checking information, contingency plans for every possible betrayal. Distance magnifies uncertainty, and uncertainty can be fatal in a world built on both fear and respect. Yet exile offered unexpected advantages. Being outside the immediate spotlight allowed for strategic observation without distraction. I could analyze the evolving dynamics of the American underworld, the shifts in political enforcement, and the economic changes affecting our enterprises. From Naples, I was a calm observer, able to guide influence and intervene only when necessary, like a chess master moving pieces across continents. The empire I built was resilient, but resilience requires enforcement. Trusted lieutenants ensured that rules were followed, territories respected, and profits flowing. I had built an organization designed to function in my absence. That is the mark of true power: structures that survive, systems that endure, and influence that extends beyond physical presence. Political climate also played a role. Post-World War II America was focused on reconstruction, anti-communist sentiment, and rebuilding domestic authority. This created opportunities for me to negotiate indirectly the continued operation of our enterprises. Allies within government and law enforcement, men I had cultivated through years of careful maneuvering, ensured that even in exile, my voice carried weight. Influence, it seemed, was a currency more valuable than borders.
Exile didn't diminish my reputation; if anything, it enhanced it.
Stories of Luciano in Naples quietly steering operations across the Atlantic spread through whispers and cautious conversations. Men on the streets of New York and Chicago spoke of decisions made miles away, of enforcements carried out without my physical presence, and of profits continuing to rise. Fear and respect, long-established tools of control, persisted, proving that distance is irrelevant when strategy and reputation are solid. Personal life, too, was affected. Exile meant separation from friends, from familiar streets, and from the daily rhythms of the empire I had built. Letters, occasional visits, and messengers bridged gaps, but nothing replaces proximity. Yet I adapted. Isolation sharpened the mind. Reflection deepened resolve. From Naples, I began to think not only about surviving but about shaping the next era of organized crime. My influence was no longer reactive, it became proactive, anticipatory, strategic. Some believed that exile would breed irrelevance. They were wrong. By leveraging communication, trusted proxies, and the enduring respect I commanded, I remained a central figure. My absence became a form of mystique. Men speculated, rivals feared, and allies remained loyal, all because the structures I had created required recognition, obedience, and respect. Influence, I realized, isn't tied to geography, it's tied to perception, enforcement, and vision. Even as I oversaw operations from afar, I had to contend with challenges. Local leaders sometimes sought to expand territory without approval. Political figures occasionally pressured contacts to undermine my directives. And younger members, ambitious and impatient, tested limits. Each scenario required careful intervention. A letter here, a discreet envoy there, and strategic reassignment of power ensured stability. Decisions had to be precise. Mistakes were magnified by distance. Reflecting on exile, I understood that power is multifaceted. It isn't only about fear, guns, or money. It's about structure, foresight, reputation, and adaptability. True influence endures regardless of physical constraints. From Naples, I had to wield authority not through intimidation alone but through strategic vision, trust, networks, and systems designed to function autonomously. This was an evolution of power, a refinement of the lessons learned from battles, betrayals, and rises to dominance. The underworld of America continued to flourish, guided by the principles and systems I had instilled. Territories remained respected. Disputes were mediated according to the rules of the Commission. Profits flowed uninterrupted. My exile became a proving ground not of weakness, but of the enduring strength of strategy over proximity. And as I sat in my modest office overlooking the Mediterranean, observing the streets of Naples with the same calculated scrutiny I had once applied to Manhattan, I realized that the empire I had built was no longer bound by geography. Influence once thought to be tied to presence had transcended borders. Loyalty, once tested on New York streets, now functioned across oceans. And strategy, honed in the alleys and backrooms of the Lower East Side, now guided a national network from afar. Exile, in the end, was not a punishment, it was a lesson, a test, and a testament to the power of foresight, reputation, and enduring systems. Even far from the city that birthed me, I remained a central force in the American underworld. My reach extended beyond physical limitations, proving that true power is not defined by proximity but by vision, structure, and the respected commands. Through exile, I became a living example of influence untethered, a strategist whose empire could function independently yet respond precisely to intervention. The legacy I had built in New York continued to thrive, guided by principles I had instilled and shaped by men who understood that loyalty, structure, and strategic foresight are more potent than guns alone. Even miles away, even across the Atlantic, the streets knew my name. The empire endured. And my mind, ever calculating, ever vigilant, ensured that the power I had built was neither forgotten nor diminished. Legends live not just in stories, they live in the systems they leave behind, in whispers on streets, and in the fear and respect that survive generations. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the empire I had built had endured wars, betrayal, law enforcement scrutiny, and even exile. My name, Lucky Luciano, had become synonymous with both fear and respect, a shadow that stretched across the country, even across generations. But legacy isn't merely about survival or notoriety. It's about systems, influence, and enduring structures that outlast the man himself. I spent countless hours reflecting on what had allowed me to rise, to consolidate power, and to create a network that could function independently of my immediate presence. Unlike the old bosses whose dominion relied on fear and impulsive loyalty, I had built an empire rooted in principles, strategy, structure, and calculated influence. The Commission remains central to this legacy, a council of organized power, a system of checks and balances where disputes could be mediated and profits maximized. It was a blueprint for modern organized crime. Stories of my exploits were told in bars, speakeasies, and private rooms across the United States. Men whispered about the boy from Sicily who arrived in New York with nothing and the man who would become the architect of a national underworld. But legend is more than myth. My legacy was concrete. Territories were respected. Rules were enforced. Profits flowed efficiently. And loyalty, carefully cultivated, ensured that the system endured. Yet legacy carries a paradox: admiration and fear walk side by side. Those who loved the structure of our empire revered the order I had imposed. Those who feared it understood that power, when wielded with vision and patience, is more dangerous than any gun. I had learned that to maintain influence, one must balance both respect and fear, ensuring that neither becomes absolute. Absolute fear breeds rebellion. Absolute admiration invites complacency. The balance is delicate, and its mismanagement can topple empires overnight. Even in exile, I influenced decisions. My guidance shaped policies, resolved disputes, and prevented conflicts from escalating. The men who carried out operations did so not just out of obedience but because they understood the logic of the system I had created. Structure breeds consistency.
Consistency breeds endurance. And endurance ultimately is the hallmark of legacy.
The cultural impact of my actions extended beyond the criminal underworld. America's perception of organized crime, its systems, and its hierarchies began to reflect the networks I had designed. Movies, books, and newspapers portrayed a world influenced by strategy, loyalty, and cunning, often inspired directly by the empire I had shaped.
While dramatized, these portrayals reinforced the notion that power could be centralized, systematized, and enduring, a reflection of my real influence. Reflection brought clarity.
I recognized the fleeting nature of life, the impermanence of physical power, and the eternal nature of influence. I had seen rivals rise and fall, friends betray, and the law challenge everything I had built. Yet through strategy, patience, and adaptability, I had created an architecture of power that could outlive me. That is the essence of true legacy: influence that persists, systems that endure, and structures that remain operational regardless of absence. Men who followed me continued to expand operations in new territories, adopting my methods, refining strategies, and negotiating alliances with the precision I had instilled. My name, once a personal identifier, had become a symbol, a blueprint for success, resilience, and strategic brilliance in organized crime.
It wasn't about fear alone, nor charm alone.
It was about a combination of foresight, methodical planning, and the understanding that empires are fragile unless fortified with structure and accountability.
The shadow I cast influenced not only organized crime but the strategies employed within it.
Men I never met personally operated under principles I had laid out decades earlier.
The network of loyalty, hierarchy, and strategic planning ensured continuity. Even as generations changed, the underlying rules endured.
Systems replaced individual dominance, ensuring that the empire's continuity was not dependent on one man, no matter how charismatic or ruthless. There were moments of reflection, quiet nights in Naples, or private moments in the few safe houses I visited. I contemplated the cost of power, the lives disrupted, the betrayals endured, and the lessons learned. Legacy, I realized, is as much about what is avoided as what is achieved. It's not only about influence, but the careful orchestration of systems that prevent collapse, the cultivation of loyalty, and the anticipation of challenges yet unseen. Political forces continued to exert pressure.
Governments sought to dismantle influence, yet the systems I created proved remarkably resilient. Men who had once feared retribution now acted with discretion, guided by principles I had established long ago.
My instructions, though delivered from afar, shaped decisions, influenced disputes, and maintained the continuity of operations. Even in absence, the architecture of power persisted.
Influence, I understood, is a living entity.
It requires maintenance, attention, and adaptation.
Without guidance, systems falter.
Without foresight, empires crumble.
I had spent decades perfecting the balance between centralized authority and operational autonomy.
This balance ensured the endurance of the commission, the continuity of profit streams, and the perpetuation of loyalty.
In this sense, my legacy was not static, it was dynamic, adaptable, and enduring. Legends fade, but structures endure.
By the time I reflected on the final chapters of my life, it was clear that the shadow I had cast was more significant than any single act of violence, negotiation, or alliance. The legacy of Luciano was not just in stories or fear, it was embedded in the systems, principles, and enduring influence that continued to guide organized crime. Generations of men operated according to frameworks I had laid, demonstrating that true power extends beyond presence, beyond immediate action, and beyond mortality. And yet the shadow carried lessons for those who would follow: power is transient, opportunity fleeting, and loyalty conditional. The systems endure only if maintained, respected, and adapted to changing circumstances. My life, my rise, my trials, and my exile became a case study not merely of ambition or criminality, but of strategy, structure, and vision.
The principles I instilled became the benchmark for enduring influence in a world where chaos and opportunity coexist.
The streets whispered, the media speculated, and historians debated, but the truth remained: Luciano's influence was indelible, built not on chance but on calculated vision, strategic foresight, and the creation of systems that transcended personal limitations. Legacy, I had learned, is not about the man who rises, it's about the empire, the influence, and the structures that persist long after the man has gone. And so, even in the quiet moments, I understood that my life's work, the empire, the commission, the systems of influence, would endure.
Beyond notoriety. Beyond fear. Beyond borders.
The principles I established would guide generations.
The shadow I cast was not a mere specter of past violence, it was a living framework, resilient, structured, and enduring.
Legacy is measured not by headlines, arrests, or notoriety, but by influence that survives time, distance, and the inevitability of change. In that reflection, I found satisfaction not in fleeting triumphs, but in the enduring systems, the men who respected them, and the influence that persisted across decades. That is the quiet power, the invisible reach, and the true definition of legacy.
Power is fleeting, but lessons last forever.
And if you listen closely, the streets still whisper the truths I learned the hard way. Looking back on decades of chaos, ambition, betrayal, and calculated victories, I see that power is a teacher ruthless and impartial. The streets taught lessons, but history delivered the most profound truths. A life spent building empires, navigating loyalties, and outmaneuvering rivals is a life filled with both triumph and consequence. Each decision, each alliance, each calculated risk was a thread woven into the intricate fabric of influence I left behind. First, I learned that patience is power. Young men rush, eager to dominate, to claim territory, to assert themselves through brute force. They fail to see that empires are not built in moments, they are constructed over decades, shaped by observation, strategy, and precise timing. Every action must be measured, every consequence anticipated. Impulsivity is the enemy of enduring authority. In my life, patience allowed me to survive wars, betrayals, and the relentless scrutiny of the law. Second, loyalty is both fragile and invaluable. Trust is earned, tested, and constantly reaffirmed. Men I raised and mentored proved loyal beyond measure, but even the strongest alliances are subject to the temptations of ambition and fear. Betrayal is inevitable, preparation for it is not optional. Understanding human nature, the flaws, desires, and fears is as critical as understanding strategy or territory. An empire that ignores this is doomed to crumble. Adaptability became another lesson. The world changes, laws evolve, rivalries shift, and opportunities appear unexpectedly. A rigid mind fails, a flexible one thrives. From the streets of Manhattan to exile in Naples, I had to adapt continuously. The commission itself was a product of adaptability, transforming chaotic violence into structured negotiation, ensuring that loyalty and profit could coexist under a system that survived my absence. Observation, subtle and relentless, is as potent as any weapon. I watched men not just for what they said, but for what they didn't say. I noted hesitation, measured reactions, and calculated probabilities. Leadership is as much about awareness as it is about decisiveness. Decisions made without understanding the terrain, whether physical, social, or political, invite disaster. A sharp eye often prevents the need for action. Insight is a tool more powerful than bullets. Patience, loyalty, adaptability, observation, these principles alone are insufficient without strategy. Every move, every alliance, every decision must align with a larger vision. Power is not the accumulation of influence in isolated pockets, it is the orchestration of forces, the anticipation of rivals, the careful deployment of assets. Even exile could not diminish influence because strategy, once embedded in structure, transcends geography. Yet reflection reveals that power is also isolating. The higher you rise, the fewer true confidants remain. Friends may turn to rivals, allies may falter, and loyalty is never guaranteed. Decisions carry weight not just in profit or territory, but in lives affected, in reputations forged or destroyed, in the perpetuation of systems that outlast individual ambition. Solitude sharpens the mind, but also reveals the cost of dominance.
Another lesson comes from the understanding of consequences. Every action triggers a chain reaction, every choice ripples through the network of influence. Violence yields fear but may also provoke retaliation. Alliances bring strength but may also create dependencies. Every move must be calculated not just for immediate gain, but for the longevity of authority. Strategy without foresight is chaos disguised as action. Legacy, ultimately, is the truest measure of power. Recognition, notoriety, or fear are fleeting, they fade with time, with generations, with changing streets. But structures, systems, principles, and influence endure. The Commission outlasted my physical presence, continued to function under carefully maintained protocols, and shaped organized crime in America for decades. Legacy is not about being remembered, it is about creating a framework that outlives the individual. I also learned that restraint is a form of strength. Not every slight deserves retaliation. Not every opportunity demands action. The world rewards the patient, the calculating, and those who understand that sometimes inaction secures dominance more effectively than overt force. Power is maintained as much by control over reaction as by action itself. Reflection taught me humility in unexpected ways. Even as I shaped empires, guided operations from afar, and influenced generations, I understood that human forces, laws, rivals, luck, unforeseen events always challenge authority. No matter how structured, disciplined, or brilliant a system is, unpredictability is inevitable. Respecting that unpredictability while planning for it is the mark of a true strategist. Exile reinforced the lesson that influence is often more potent than presence. Decisions communicated with precision, trust networks maintained diligently, and principles enforced consistently ensured that absence did not equal irrelevance. True power is not measured by proximity, it is measured by the ability to shape outcomes without being physically present, to command respect, and to sustain authority across distance and time. Looking back, I also see the human cost of power. Alliances broken, lives lost, ambitions crushed, families affected. The pursuit of influence and empire is rarely without consequence. Reflection forces acknowledgement that survival and dominance exact a price not just in lives or territory, but in the erosion of trust, the burden of vigilance, and the constant tension between ambition and ethics. But above all, I learned that vision defines destiny. The streets of New York, the smoky backrooms, the Council of the Commission, they were all manifestations of a vision translated into reality. Strategy without vision is directionless. Vision without strategy is fantasy. A man who aspires to power must cultivate both with relentless dedication, understanding that every choice serves the larger purpose of shaping an enduring legacy. And so, in quiet reflection during the final chapters of life, I recognize the principles that allowed me to survive, thrive, and shape history. Patience, loyalty, adaptability, observation, strategic thinking, restraint, and vision, these are the lessons the streets teach, the laws of power that endure beyond any one life. They define not just success, but survival, influence, and the quiet authority that lasts beyond notoriety. To those who follow in the world of ambition, chaos, and influence, these lessons remain timeless. The streets whisper them, history records them, and those who observe carefully may glean wisdom from them. A life of power is not glamorous, it is fraught with peril, burdened by responsibility, and tested by both men and circumstance. But it is also a life of opportunity, an opportunity to shape systems, influence generations, and leave a legacy that survives the inevitable march of time. In the end, I see clearly that power is a teacher, betrayal is inevitable, influence is resilient, and legacy is eternal. My life was a testament to these truths. From the Lower East Side to the Commission, from the streets of New York to Exile and Naples, the lessons of survival, strategy, and vision were lived daily, tested repeatedly, and ultimately endured. Power is fleeting, they say. But influence, carefully cultivated and strategically maintained, is immortal. That is the final reflection, the quiet truth that defines a life spent in pursuit of authority, respect, and enduring legacy. The streets may change, the players may be new,
but the rules I wrote decades ago still echo in every corner of organized crime. By the time I reflected on the modern era, it was clear that the blueprint I had established in the 1930s had evolved, adapted, and endured. The commission I founded was no longer just a council of powerful men, it had become a model for modern organized crime worldwide. From coast to coast, from New York to Chicago to Los Angeles, operations continued to reflect the principles I instilled: structure, loyalty, negotiation, and calculated influence. The evolution of organized crime is a story of adaptation, but adaptation built on foundation. Modern mob families learned quickly that unregulated violence, impulsive decisions, and fractured leadership lead to collapse. My model, by contrast, emphasized conflict mediation, territory respect, and hierarchies of authority. This structure minimized internal warfare, maximized profits, and allowed operations to persist even when individual players were removed.
In essence, my influence became systemic.
Generations of gangsters, some who never met me personally, operated according to rules that were drafted, tested, and enforced decades earlier.
This continuity demonstrated the durability of strategy over mere charisma.
I had shown that a man can build an empire, but an empire built on principles, systems, and enforceable agreements can survive centuries. Modern families adapted these lessons, using them to navigate both legitimate and illicit opportunities while maintaining secrecy and efficiency. Technology, law enforcement tactics, and globalization presented new challenges, but the core principles remained unchanged. Territory management, hierarchical communication, enforcement of rules, and strategic alliances were as vital in the 21st century as they were in 1930s Manhattan. My strategies provided a framework for how organized crime could not just survive but thrive amid societal evolution and intensified scrutiny. Even as police forces became more sophisticated, surveillance more intrusive, and laws stricter, my influence lingered.
Systems once implemented have a way of outlasting those who created them.
The balance of fear and respect, the strategic delegation of authority, and the careful orchestration of operations are lessons that continue to inform leadership within organized crime. Leaders learned that the perception of omnipresence can be as powerful as actual presence, a principle I perfected during exile. Modern mobsters, knowingly or unknowingly, replicate the strategies I employ to maintain power across distance and time. Proxy leadership, delegated authority, discrete communication networks, and contingency planning are no longer innovations, they are standard operating procedures. The lessons are embedded into the culture of organized crime, demonstrating that influence is most effective when codified, internalized, and enforced consistently.
Consider the approach to dispute resolution. Violent retaliation may be dramatic, but it is inefficient.
I introduced mechanisms to mediate conflicts before they escalated, ensuring continuity of operations and stability within territories. Today, modern families use similar structures, often holding councils or meetings to resolve disputes internally, reducing exposure and risk. These systems are my legacy, proof that a measured approach to power yields sustainability.
The concept of diversified operations, another principle I championed, is evident in the evolution of organized crime today.
No longer reliant on a single source of revenue, modern organizations spread risk across gambling, narcotics, labor influence, and legitimate enterprises. Diversification stabilizes income, mitigates law enforcement pressure, and ensures that the removal of a single operator does not cripple the enterprise. This principle, rooted in strategies I employed decades ago, continues to guide operational resilience.
Influence and reputation remain critical. Even as media and law enforcement expose the underworld, my name continues to serve as a symbol of strategic acumen.
Stories of Luciano's rise, consolidation of power, and enforcement of structure continue to be studied by both criminologists and those seeking to understand the dynamics of influence in high-stakes environments. Reputation, I had learned early, is currency, sometimes more valuable than cash or guns.
Modern organized crime also reflects lessons in patience and timing. Ambitions are pursued with consideration of risk, alliances are formed with foresight, and strategic retreats are employed when necessary.
The wisdom of measured action, learned through my experiences with betrayal, exile, and legal pressure, remains deeply embedded in contemporary operations. Those who fail to recognize the importance of timing, patience, and calculated intervention risk collapse.
The geographical spread of influence is another evolution of principles I implemented.
While my operations were initially concentrated in New York, the Commission allowed coordination across cities, respecting territorial boundaries while maximizing profitability. Today, multi-state coordination, transnational alliances, and cross-industry networks reflect the same principle, a central strategy guiding decentralized execution.
Modern leaders understand that influence need not be omnipresent to be effective, it must be structured, enforced, and respected. Law enforcement and regulatory pressure continue to shape operations, but the principles of contingency planning, adaptive strategy, and redundancy that I champion remain central.
Modern leaders prepare for inevitable threats, cultivate loyal proxies, and implement systems that survive the removal of individuals. In essence, the structural lessons I taught decades ago have become the standard for enduring operations under scrutiny. Even as the streets evolve, the human factor, the balance of ambition, fear, loyalty, and trust remains unchanged.
This is the essence of my enduring influence.
Tools, technology, and scale may change, but the core human dynamics of power, betrayal, and strategy remain constant. Understanding this is crucial for anyone seeking to maintain control in an unpredictable world. And so my shadow persists, not in headlines alone, not in myth alone, but in the very architecture of modern organized crime. Leadership, negotiation, conflict resolution, territory respect, delegation, and strategic planning all reflect principles I established, refined, and enforced decades ago. My influence is woven into the DNA of the underworld, proving that true power is not ephemeral.
It endures through structure, strategy, and vision.
The lessons of my life, the patience, adaptability, strategic foresight, and cultivation of loyalty, continue to shape behavior in ways both subtle and profound. Even generations removed from my era, men who navigate the world of organized crime do so within frameworks I helped design.
Influence, when institutionalized, transcends time. Systems endure where individuals cannot. Reflection reveals that my legacy is not just a story of notoriety or infamy. It is a study in leadership, strategy, and resilience. From my rise on the streets of New York to guiding an empire from exile to watching systems thrive long after my departure, the principles I implemented endure. Modern organized crime operates with methods that are, in essence, the natural evolution of my strategic vision. And that is the enduring truth: empires built on calculation, foresight, and structure outlive the men who create them. Violence may command attention, fear may enforce obedience, but strategy, organization, and vision define endurance. The modern underworld is a reflection, a testament, and a continuation of the lessons I learned and applied over decades of survival, conquest, and leadership. Power fades, streets change, and empires crumble, but the lessons, the influence, and the shadow we leave behind endure far beyond a single lifetime. As I reflect on the life I led, the streets I walked, and the empire I built, I see clearly that power is both intoxicating and fleeting. Every decision carried weight, every alliance had consequences, and every action rippled far beyond the moment it occurred. Influence is temporary if it is not cemented by strategy, structure, and foresight. I learned that authority is not merely enforced by presence or violence, it is sustained through systems, respect, and the cultivation of loyalty. Mortality looms over every empire. Even the strongest, most feared figures face limits imposed by time, circumstance, and human frailty. I lived knowing this truth intimately. Friends fell, rivals vanished, and the law relentlessly pursued the ambitious. Yet within these constraints, I discovered the nature of enduring influence. It transcends the lifespan of the individual,
extending through networks, principles, and systems that persist long after one is gone.
Reflection brings humility.
No empire, no matter how meticulously crafted, survives without the cooperation, loyalty, and effort of those who inhabit it. I relied on men who shared vision and discipline, who executed strategies with precision, and who understood the balance of fear and respect. Leadership, I realized, is not about domination alone, it is about stewardship, guiding complex structures through uncertain times while preparing successors to maintain continuity. Exile, betrayal, and imprisonment all reinforced the impermanence of physical presence. Yet they also illuminated the resilience of influence. From Naples, I guided decisions, mediated disputes, and ensured that the Commission continued to function effectively. Power, I discovered, is less about proximity and more about perception, systems, and foresight. Distance can strengthen authority if it is exercised strategically, absence does not equal irrelevance if influence is structured and enforced thoughtfully. Mortality also taught lessons about priorities. Life is measured not only in victories, territory, and wealth, but in the enduring impact one leaves behind.
Influence, respect, and strategic vision become the true markers of legacy. Violence and fear may secure immediate compliance, but they do not guarantee continuity. Only principles, systems, and foresight create an enduring imprint. This is the quiet truth of power, it is most potent when institutionalized, adaptive, and resilient. Even as empires rise and fall, the lessons of leadership endure. Patience, observation, adaptability, loyalty, foresight, and restraint are not mere abstractions, they are practical tools that govern survival and success in high-stakes environments. These are the principles I applied daily, often in moments of crisis, sometimes in silence, and always with the awareness that one miscalculation could unravel decades of influence. Legacy, I realized, is a reflection of foresight and strategic design. The Commission, the systems I built, the rules I established all endure because they were constructed to function beyond my physical presence. Modern organized crime, in its methods, hierarchies, and dispute resolution, reflects these principles. Influence is immortalized not in headlines alone but in the enduring operation of systems that survive leadership transitions and generational change. Mortality also sharpens perspective. The moments of calm, late nights in exile, private reflection, quiet observation of men executing my directives offered clarity. The thrill of conquest fades, the satisfaction of dominance diminishes, but understanding the enduring mechanisms of influence provides a lasting sense of accomplishment. True power is not in temporary victories, it is in shaping outcomes, guiding systems, and creating resilience that transcends a single life. Power and mortality are inseparable teachers. They enforce discipline, sharpen judgment, and reveal the cost of ambition. Every decision I made carried risk, and every strategy was tested by circumstance. Even in exile, removed from the immediate arena of action, I felt the weight of responsibility. Influence had to be exercised carefully, principles had to be upheld, and foresight had to account for the unpredictable behavior of men, law enforcement, and rivals. I learned to reconcile ambition with humility. Recognition, fear, and respect are transient. Systems endure. The streets reward foresight more than impulse, preparation more than recklessness. Understanding mortality, the inevitability of human limits, allows a leader to build structures that survive beyond personal involvement. My legacy, therefore, is not simply in my reputation but in the principles and systems that outlast me. Reflection also illuminates the human element. Power is meaningless without people. Influence requires men who understand the stakes, who share vision, and who act with discipline. Betrayal is always possible, loyalty always conditional. The task of leadership is to anticipate human nature, cultivate trust carefully, and enforce systems that guide behavior in ways that ensure stability. This remains true across eras, borders, and generations. Even the most feared, the most cunning, and the most powerful must face mortality. This inevitability does not diminish influence, it clarifies it. The challenge lies in creating impact that transcends presence, control that endures without proximity, and legacy that survives beyond the life of the architect. True mastery is revealed not in conquest but in construction, the building of resilient systems that continue to function long after the individual is gone.
And so I reflect on the totality of my life: risks taken, empires built, betrayals survived, and systems maintained.
Influence, carefully cultivated, persists.
Power, fleeting and fragile, can be transformed into enduring authority through foresight, structure, and loyalty. Mortality underscores the value of strategy, patience, and adaptability. Every life, every empire, is a lesson in these principles. Even as time marches forward, the streets continue to whisper the truths I lived. My influence is felt not just in stories, books, or films, but in the ongoing operation of principles and structures that guide modern organized crime.
The blueprint remains: strategic oversight, conflict mediation, delegation of authority, respect for territory, and cultivation of loyalty. These are not relics of the past, they are the enduring architecture of influence.
In the end, power is ephemeral, mortality is inevitable, and influence is eternal when applied wisely. Lessons learned through hardship, reflection, and strategic foresight endure far longer than individual life. A man may fall, rivals may rise, and streets may change, but the systems he builds, the principles he enforces, and the influence he cultivates define a legacy that transcends mortality. And so, as I contemplate the quiet of exile, the echo of decisions across oceans, and the enduring impact of decades of strategy and leadership, I understand the ultimate truth of power: it is measured not in fear or wealth, not in victories or territory, but in the resilience, adaptability, and longevity of the influence one leaves behind.